And once you've chosen it, don't keep questioning yourself, because if you look at the toppers list, you'll find that people from every optional make it there. So don't blame your optional as the only reason you failed, unless it's the paper you've done very badly in. Now, for sociology specifically, if you see, it's very much like general studies, the entire sociology paper, except for the thinkers. So I'll break it down to two parts. One are the thinkers, and one is the remaining paper, which is, like I said, just in fact the same thing you would almost write in a GS answer. So thinkers are, for paper one, more than half the paper is, when you read it, is based on the main thinkers: Marx, Weber, Parsons. It doesn't really matter which source you refer to, because ultimately these thinkers are basically, you find the same concepts in multiple places. I use notes from a previous year topper. You can refer to any, and I think IGNU notes, you can refer to any source which you can understand easily. Since I had taken one or two courses on sociology, I was already familiar with some of the concepts, so I didn't need to spend time reading the basic books. But if you're completely new, you might want to try that. Thinkers are the most interesting part of the paper, I felt, and it's not very separate between thinkers and the rest of the paper, because you'll be using these same thinkers in all your answers as well. The trick is to understand how to use these thinkers in an answer, and what makes a sociology answer more sociological than a GS answer. So what I decided was that the difference between sociology and GS is that GS is about what I think, and sociology is about what sociologists think. So I'm asked a question about religion. I never write, when I read a question about, let's say, what is religion and what are its functions, I never think about, I read the question not as what do you think about religion and its functions, I read the question as what do sociologists think about religion and its functions. The point is that every question I would try to throw in as many names of sociological thinkers and what they've said, not about what I've said. In some questions this isn't possible, because they ask slightly unusual questions like fashion and ecology, which you probably wouldn't have thinkers ready for. I'll tell you some ways to approach these questions as well in this talk. So one problem you might have is, how do I remember so many thinkers? For this, you need to look back once you finish reading the basic thinker, the 6 big thinkers in paper 1, Marx, Weber, Parsons, and the others, and realize that they're all really interrelated. You can integrate any of the thinkers in any answer, and you won't have to remember new thinkers for every answer. If you ask about religion, if you ask about even the functional approach towards religion, you can mention Durkheim and Parsons. And then when you want to criticize them, just talk about Marx's approach towards religion, talk about Weber's approach towards religion, talk about Robert Malinowski's study of religion. These same thinkers you've already studied. It's just that the question is now about religion rather than about a thinker, but you still use all the thinkers, and you keep mixing them up based on the demand of the question. If the question about Marxian concept of religion, then you use Weber and you use functional approach towards religion to criticize that question. So for sociology, like GS, I followed a standard framework for my answers because it helped me write faster, think faster, and make the whole process much simpler. I would break down the answer into smaller subdimensions. So you'd probably either have a 10 marker or a 20 marker. Depending on that, you need to decide how many subdimensions you'll fit your answer into and how big each subdimension should be. I'd usually begin with a simple introduction, which was almost always the definition. And the definition would be, as far as possible, a sociologist's definition. For religion, I would give Durkheim's definition, or if for some reason I couldn't recall it, or the question was about Marx's concept, I would talk about opium of the masses instead of that. If the question was about deviance, then I would talk about Merton's definition, or maybe Durkheim's definition, depending on if the question specified anything, otherwise whichever one I preferred. After you've done the introduction or definition, you come to talking about the concept. Concept is where you put the thinkers. So if you're asked about deviance, you talk about Merton's conception of deviance and how different people react differently because of the goals and the means and the discrepancies between these. This is where you throw in the thinkers. As far as possible, don't talk about anything without mentioning who said it. I'd simply write the name of the thinker, put a dash, and indicate that this is what he said. if it's a generic question, if it's a specific question, you'll probably talk about that one thinker. So if they ask about Marx or Merton, you'll talk about Marx and Merton. But if it's generally on religion, then I try to put in at least 3 or 4 thinkers, different views of religion. So then it depends if you have it depends again on the number of marks your question is for and how much time and space you have. If you're asked to discuss something, you probably wouldn't criticize it much. If at all, you just write 1 or 2 short criticisms if you don't have much content. If you're asked to analyze something, analyze means criticism in the sense both positive criticism and negative criticism. So it would be an introduction with a definition, explain the concept, then write about a positive feature of the concept. So for religion, you can write how functionalism explains how we have pluralistic societies like India living peacefully together. And you focus on how religion can have benefits for the individual, like Robert Malinowski's study shows. Then you'd go to the negative criticism, which is basically why is this concept flawed. If it's about the functions of religion, you criticize this negatively. You talk about Marx's view of religion, that it's opium of the masses and it protects the interests of the ruling class. And one more thing, that before you talk about the criticism, you look at what the question wants. If it's, let's say, a question asking you to discuss something, you'd probably want to put an example instead of a criticism. So for example, it's as far as possible, it's better to relate it to current affairs. If you want an example of the negative features of religion, it's very simple to look at Islamic radicalism in the Middle East. If you want example of the positive features of religion, you can again pick so many examples of that. Let's say the Sikh langars distributing food to the jobless during COVID. This is where current affairs comes very handy. Everything you read in the news is actually an example in sociology. Like Greta Thunberg is an example of women empowerment, youth empowerment, ecological issues making their way in the collective conscience of society. So try to relate the news headlines to sociology, and you find that you don't need to specifically remember too many examples. And so you've got an introduction, you've explained the concept, you can put an example if it's relevant, then you can criticize it if you're asked to analyze it, and then you can end it with a simple 1 or 2 line, just a summary, nothing fancy, because you don't have too much time to think of a very polished ending. And based on this, you split your answer into smaller framework. You won't have to remember too many points for each, because you'll hardly have 30 or 40, maximum 50 words in any single dimension. This means that remembering these is very easy, because I've found that 3 or 5 points anyone can remember, but remembering 15 points becomes a big pain. So this is how thinkers will help you answer most of the questions. But some questions are slightly unusual in the sense that they ask about topics which you won't find anywhere else, and most thinkers don't mention these things. I think there was one question related to terrorism or ecology in the paper. Then one year there was a question on fashion. Here you need to innovate. Either you use examples, and examples of ecology are abundant anywhere. You'll find the small island developing states pressing their case in the UN because they're the most affected, how poor and vulnerable are the most affected. And even here, it's very simple to use Marxist and functionalist approach for any issue. Terrorism for the Marxist approach is simply the oppressed class raising its voice against the ruling class. For functionalism, you can link it to deviance and talk about how it's people who are rebelling against the collective conscience and trying to introduce new values, and that even an issue like terrorism might, in a sense, be inevitable or functional for society. So Marxism and functionalism essentially are two opposite thought processes, and they can fit in almost anywhere. Use that to your advantage when you have questions which are slightly unusual. You might not know the thinker, but you can still mention Marxist view, functionalist view, and that's still sociological in a sense. Otherwise, put in examples wherever possible, examples mostly from current affairs. If not, then you still have to try to innovate, because it's, in a sense, you can't really leave a question and expect to get a good score. Every question counts, and the difference I would say attempting all the questions, writing average answers is better than attempting less number of questions, writing great answers. So for this will come only with practice, with reading the newspaper, with an eye to link it to sociology, and by thinking about all the other sociologists you've read about and trying to fit their views wherever they make sense. For sociology specifically, you will also notice that it's very much like GS, so especially paper 2, that a lot of effort isn't needed in knowing the points you want to write, because there are things which most of us already know. Just make sure that you, as far as possible, you don't mention the point without mentioning a thinker. These thinkers are relatively lesser known sociologists. You'll find them in the test series you do. I found some of them over there and I noted them down. These are thinkers most people probably have not even heard of. You'll even know the points already, what they're saying. Just make sure you still mention their name. Even if you're writing something as simple as causes of migration and push factors and pull factors of migration, you'll find there's always some sociologist who said that before. Just put in that name. And since these thinkers are also less known, this is your advantage. It doesn't matter whether you write feminist thinker A or B has said a point. I didn't remember who said what exactly. I just knew this person is a feminist thinker. He or she is likely to have said this, so I would put in that. I don't think anyone is going to really look into and analyze whether this